Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar titled Are You Really Compliant? What No One Tells You About ELD versus AOBRD, presented by our member EROAD. This is Vilya Jositis with the Oregon Trucking Associations, and thank you for joining us. We have received an influx of questions regarding the ELD mandate over the past few months, so we hope you find the information valuable and timely. After the presentation, the slides will be available to OTA members using our online login portal. If you are not a member, we'll provide you with our contact information at the end of the presentation to obtain the slides. And now, here's Brittany Wooten with EROAD.
Thank you, Vilya. It's a pleasure to be here today. As Vilya mentioned, my name is Brittany Wooten, Community Manager for EROAD. I will be facilitating the webinar this morning. I'll go over a few ground rules, but first, I'd love for you all to participate in our poll. Take a look at your screen in just a moment here. All right, and take a look at your screen for the question. We'd like to understand a little bit more about where everyone's at on their journey to ELD. While you fill that out, we'll go over a few housekeeping items for today's session. If you have any technical difficulties or issues with the audio, please let us know right away by IMing us in the chat box. We will also have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so if you have any questions while you're listening in, feel free to submit them in the question box and we'll get to them at the end. Now, to introduce today's webinar experts, we have Soona Lee, EROAD's Regulatory Compliance Manager. She's responsible for understanding the regulations and policies that you and I both work within every day and translate those to make sure our products meet every technical requirement. We also have Susan Reszczynski, Sales Engineer for EROAD. Susan brings knowledge from both carrier and driver perspectives, and we like to call her the bridge between customers and product. Susan actually used to work at OTA, so she may be a familiar face, or a voice in this case, to some of you. With that, I will pass it over to Soona and Susan.
Thank you so much, Brittany and Vilya. It's a pleasure to be here with Susan. My name is Soona, and I'm here with Susan Reszczynski. Hi, guys. And we're delighted to actually run this webinar today. So the polling results are coming in, and we'll be closing that off in just a few moments. So if you haven't voted already, please do so, and we'll cover off the results very shortly. So we've heard many of our customers, Susan, right, that have been telling us that they've been confused and unable to tell the difference between products that are out in the market today, and especially how to tell the difference between an automatic onboard recording device, AOBRD, and an electronic logging device, an ELD. So this is that's the focus of our webinar today, to be able to talk about, are you going to be really compliant, and what no one really tells you about the differences between those. So let us just take a quick stock take of the polls, if we can close that off. So I'm sure you can see the poll results on your screen, but we can see that there's 26% of you that are using an ELD right now, 10% that are using an AOBRD, 10% using electronic logbook applications, 55%, which is the majority, that are still using paper-based logbooks, and 23% who are not sure.
Yeah, so 55%, that's really good. So this will be really good and very informative, and we hope that after this webinar you'll be closer to understanding and be able to make a decision on what you're going to be doing, whether it's ELD or an AOBRD. So
great. So with that in mind, let's click over to today's presentation. So the purpose of this presentation, our aim is to explain the key differences between an electronic logging device, an ELD, and an automatic onboard recording device, an AOBRD, and explain why those are really important for you and your operations. We will try and tackle what that grandfathering in clause really means. We know that if you are using an automatic onboard recording device, AOBRD, you're going to get 2 additional years to adopt an ELD. So is this a really good thing for you, or is it not? And what are some of the caveats around this that's not really explicitly clear unless you ask those kind of right questions? So Susan and I have been working really closely with many of our customers through the transition to an ELD, and we've summarized a few steps and tips for you so that you can prepare for the compliance with that ELD mandate. that Susan will go over near the end of this presentation. And so ultimately, our goal together is with this webinar is to ensure that you gain full understanding about the differences between an ELD and an AOBRD so that you can be confident in the decision you make. Because as we all know, knowledge means power, right, Susan?
Yes, it does.
So let's turn to the difference between an ELD and an AOBRD and why they're so important. So to get started, let's do a quick overview of the regulations that give rise to AOBRD and ELD. So firstly, turning to AOBRDs, the regulations for the AOBRD was put in place in 1988. It's specified in the Title 49 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 395, Section 395.15. It's not a very long requirement, and it provides quite a broad brush of what's needed to be captured and presented. Clearly, there's been a lot of technical advancements and changes since the late 1980s, so it's quite necessary for regulations to keep up with the times. So the ELD final rule, which outlines the mandate for the use of ELDs by interstate drivers, was published in December of 2015. It sets out in very extensive detail the technical and functional requirements for an ELD in the same Title 49 CFR Part 395, but in a whole new appendix, Subpart B. It outlines all of the requirements that an ELD must satisfy. So let's go into some of the major areas and compare between the requirements for an AOBRD and an ELD. So to start off with, let's go over the roadside inspection requirements. With AOBRDs, roadside inspections have varied processes and outcomes due to the lack of standardization across the devices, which provided limited or minimal information to the road enforcement officials. For example, it didn't really require any graph grids to be provided, and it only required the list of duty status changes to be there. So the ELD mandate sought to standardize the recording and ensure a consistent method for roadside inspections across the board. So ELD must have the capability to transfer the ELD data output files via one of these two options. One is the telematics option, which means both the web services and email capability to transfer the ELD data output file. And two is the local transfer option, which means to transfer the data via a USB that needs to be inserted to the device or through Bluetooth. Now, an ELD provider must choose one of these two transfer options. All the systems, however, must also have a fallback option. So FMCSA anticipated that there is going to be data processes and systems, but there may be exceptions where the system doesn't really work. So in the scenario where that occurs, as a backup, the ELD must be able to present the driver's log information by either a display or a printout away from the vehicle. So the new provision section in the mandate 4.8.1.2b says an ELD must be designed so that its display may be reasonably viewed by an authorized safety official without entering the commercial motor vehicle. For example, the display may be untethered from its mount or connected in a manner that would allow it to be passed outside of the vehicle for a reasonable distance. So EROAD has been working really closely with the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance to demonstrate ELD's capability, and there's clear guidance for the inspection officials to be able to note not enter the cab, and there may be some conditions around whether the inspection official is able to handle the personalized mobile devices or not. So you need to really think carefully about the devices that you select, whether it's an AOBRD or an ELD option that may be suitable for you. And so what this really means is that some AOBRDs that you may go with may require a different connection or a printer to be installed in order for it to meet these backup options. So you need to really think carefully about what it can do for your operations out there during the roadside inspection.
Yes, and what we've seen, and I've gotten a lot of confusion, a lot of questions on this, is in order for it to be an ELD, it must meet what Soona was talking about. It must be able to be removed from the vehicle and given to enforcement outside of the vehicle. That is not currently required of an AOBRD. But AOBRDs are a technology and rules that are going away. So it must meet that requirement and must transition to that requirement. So please, if you're using, for those, I think 10% of you using an AOBRD, contact your AOBRD provider and ask them how they're going to meet that requirement in order to be an ELD, because they will need to transition to that to be an ELD.
Right. Okay, so turning to one of the other provisions, malfunctions in data diagnostics. So the policy rationale behind ELDs was to reduce falsifications around driving time and ensure more accurate hours of service information to be captured. So the integrity of that data from the ELD depends on the capability of the device itself to be able to monitor and diagnose any malfunctions and tampering that occurs. So where a device is tampered with, for example, it's when the power is removed or the location cannot be retrieved because the device is being covered or the connection to the engine's disconnected or jammed, the integrity of the data captured may be adversely affected. So in these situations, an ELD needs to be able to capture and record, to monitor, detect, and record that information. AOBRDs were required to be tamper-proof and be able to identify sensor failures, but it was really left to the AOBRD provider to determine what those are. So it left it quite open-ended. What it really means for you, there is a provision in the ELD mandate under section 395.3.4 that places the responsibility on the carrier to fix and resolve malfunctions within 8 days. Given this short period of time, it's really important to ensure that your drivers and support staff know how to identify and resolve any malfunctions that arise on an ELD and work with the ELD provider to understand what malfunctions can arise and how to resolve them. And it will take some time to get used to those, so it's important to use the time that you have remaining to transition to an ELD to go through those steps. So another area, location is another area where there's a lot of differences between an AOBRD and ELD in the requirement section. So the frequency, which is how often a location is captured, and the accuracy and precision, which is how close it is to the actual location, are clearly specified in the ELD mandate. In contrast, with some AOBRDs, an ELD must automatically capture the lat-long coordinates at certain points in time, which are not required for an AOBRD. So an ELD actually can protect the driver's privacy a lot more than with an AOBRD. Specifically, when the driver is operating under personal conveyance, the ELD must only capture the location at the beginning and the end with a reduced precision. So it's to a 10-mile radius rather than 1-mile radius if the driver was in a driving status. So another thing is the way that the location information must be displayed on an ELD for roadside inspection is to show the distance and direction to the nearby city, town, and village of a state with a population size of more than 5,000. So this means that if a driver is driving through remote areas, then the location will show a geoconversion that may be to a faraway town or state. Now, what does it mean for you operationally? If you're relying on an ELD location record for other purposes, then you will need to ensure that you know what you're going to get. For example, if you're going to use ELD information for tax reporting, such as for your fuel tax, IFTA, IRP, or with weight mileage tax in Oregon, which require a lot more frequent and accurate recordings compared to ELDs, then you need to make sure that you know what you are getting into, because you may not be able to meet the compliance requirements around an audit. So because those will require you to capture substantially more information, like state line crossings, maybe the road types that you're on, because you may want to calculate your exempt miles. So you just need to make sure that whichever provider solution you're using has the necessary location information that you need for an operational perspective. Right, Susan? So, you know, some of our customers use ELDs for other purposes, right?
Yes, yes, they do. And so, same with an AOBRD or an ELD. If you are, there's some confusion out with customers and with carriers that they're thinking that the ELD platform or AOBRD platform, you know, compliance that's picking up information on location and other things for it to calculate the hours of service are the same for IFTA and IRP and for the tax platform part of it, and they're not. So Soona did an ELD panel recently where there was an actual DOT tax auditor in the audience, and we were asking about the location and how specific the location needs to be for the tax, and if it's the same, and we would ask specifically about how the location was captured and if that would be compliant on the tax platform. And Soona, can you explain that a little bit better, like kind of where some of the locations take on, and some of them are compliant, some of them are not. So
yeah, so a couple of examples. There are systems that are out there that may not be retrieving the actual location. It may be retrieving it to the nearby post office.
That's
or
what it was.
Yeah. And if so, then it may not be sufficient to meet some of the tax obligations that you have. So just make sure you ask those questions of the providers that you're choosing to go with, and that you are safe and compliant and prepared for an audit.
And another point to make on that is the data. So the data that's, if you're using a technology solution and you're capturing it for hours of service and you're capturing information like you would get off of your paper logs now to satisfy your IFTA record keeping requirements, the data that is retrieved and stored, it depends who owns that data. So if your technology provider will keep your data for you for the 6-month required period for your logbooks, but you need to keep that information for the tax part of it for longer, for the 5-year retention period, they might charge you to store it for the extra period of time. So with EROAD, the data is yours. We keep it for as long as you need it for, but it is very important for you when you're looking at using an ELD or an AOBR for something else like IFTA or tax purposes, that you're looking into that.
That's a great point, Susan. Okay, so the next requirement, it's around automated driving status. So the requirement definitely highlights how the regulations have really caught up with the technology capability today. So AOBRDs did not require driving status to be recorded automatically. Whereas with the ELDs, it must be able to automatically record the driving status once the vehicle reaches 5 miles per hour. So Susan, you and I have heard from a lot of carriers that have experience using AOBRDs that have told us that some AOBRDs do capture driving automatically. However, sometimes they do so once it reaches a higher speed threshold of 10 miles per hour or 15 miles per hour, for example. So what do you think is the impact on this for a carrier?
Well, what we've seen is really interesting is as you know, there's always that driver training component, and getting the drivers in the habit to be compliant and to do something correctly. It just takes time. So if they're currently using an AOBR and there's not requirement, that 5 mile an hour requirement, and they're used to being able to go 12 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour before it kicks into drive, they're used to that. That's the habit. So when you switch to an ELD and it's automatically set at 5 miles an hour, that is quite a difference. So crawling around at 4 miles an hour out there, or going 12 or 15, and then the drivers are expecting it to behave the same, and it's not. So you're having to train them, and you're having to retrain them, to form another habit where whether they're fueling or moving around a yard, or they're asked to move the truck on a break, that they have to know that the 5 miles an hour is the new compliance. So it's confusing for them to have it set at both. So if you are, and when you do the switch, make sure that you're transitioning as soon as possible. You give them enough time, and you're giving them the information that it is different, and then it's not per the ELD provider to set, but is actually set per Federal Motor Carrier, per the mandate, at 5 miles an hour. So a lot of frustration with the drivers in understanding this, and who sets the rule, why do they have to do it, and then because it's an operational challenge for them, right, to change to that.
So you're suggesting that it's better to start earlier rather than later.
Start earlier, making sure the drivers are aware, getting them used to that change earlier, so that they can plan, and it sets them up for success rather than failure.
Right. Okay. That's awesome. In terms of editing driver records, so the ELD mandate makes it really clear, based on all the legal challenges it's really faced over the years, that the driver's log really belongs to the driver. So it made it really clear with the ELD, the driver must have the ability to review,
edit, and annotate the ELD record at all times. A carrier may suggest an edit, but it's upon the driver who really reserves the right to accept or reject any of the proposed edits. So a few other criteria around editing on ELDs. It's that driving time cannot be shortened or removed, and all edits must be accompanied by an explanation in the remarks section. So operationally, this means that if you're used to using an AOBRD, excuse me, that allow the carrier to have the final edit rights, that it may mean an adjustment to some changes. It will require working with your drivers to ensure some good practice of reviewing frequently and ensuring that the logs are current and up to date and to stay compliant. So associated with that is a new requirement around special driving categories around yard move and personal conveyance, which are finally being defined and accommodated with the ELD mandate. It's also clearly set out how these must be used under the ELD mandate as well. So it's incumbent on the carrier to be able to set up the drivers on the ELD support system and control the permissions for using the yard move or personal conveyance statuses. You may be allowed to you may only allow for yard move or personal conveyance, none at all, or both. The drivers, when using these statuses, are required to ensure that they select it before they drive in order for the status to apply, and then also deselect when they leave the vehicle and change duty statuses. So Susan, you and I have actually worked with several of our customers in training the drivers around yard move, and I've certainly noticed that it's an area where we've given a lot of training. So do you want to explain why it's beneficial to start working on this early?
Well, with the paper log, you have your 4 statuses. So you're off, sleeper, drive, and you're on duty. So basically, you're adding another status. So drivers aren't used to what a yard is, you know, when they're going into a yard, having to, you know, think about that. And it is a manual entry. So you can't, you know, set a geofence. And with some AOBRs, it's set, you know, to where, you know, when they're entering geofence locations or out of it, it automatically switches. With the ELD, it doesn't automatically switch. So
right.
the drivers are having to think about, okay, I need to put myself in yard move, I need to take myself out of yard move, and they do have to plan a little bit better strategically, because it could, if they do not do it properly, it could eat into their drive time. So like we were talking about before, Soona, making sure that, you know, you're setting your drivers up for success. You want them to form habits on how to do something, but you know, the brain takes about 30 days to implement a new habit, you know, when you're doing something every day. So they're not going to get it right away. They're not used to it. So just getting them used to it, getting them using it, you know, just putting them in the truck and saying, here's this new yard, you know, move status that you can pick when you go into a yard. There's just a lot of questions that come with that in training. So setting your drivers up ahead of time, giving them some practice. And you'll get a lot of questions, and so your back office staff too needs to be trained when they can use yard moves, when they can't use yard moves, if they forget to go out of the status and they're driving down the road, how they need to annotate that. So there's a lot of things operationally that you don't think about, you know, until you get out there. And so give yourself the time to, you know, to work through it, right, to practice and to demo it, because it is different. It is a change from a paper log.
That's really good advice, I think. So another area that is of difference is around certification and registration. And I know that this is being discussed a lot amongst industry. So to go over that a little bit, AOBRDs and ELDs actually both require self-certifications against the respective requirements, you know, AOBRD 395.15, and with ELDs, the whole mandate itself. Now, the key difference with the ELDs is that for the first time, you know, ELD providers must actually register their products with the FMCSA. That registry is public, and everybody can go and check which ones have being self-certified and registered. So that's the website link that you can see on the screen right now. However, be aware that given that it is self-certification, the FMCSA does not approve or check that any of the devices registered are compliant. However, what you need to note is that when an ELD provider does register, they must demonstrate a few things. So an ELD provider actually has to demonstrate to FMCSA that there is an ELD user manual outlining how a driver can operate the ELD, It must provide an explanation of the internal testing procedures to validate that the ELD satisfies all the functional requirements outlined in the mandate. It must also present a list of all the malfunctions and data diagnostics that can arise on an ELD and how they can be resolved by a driver or the support personnel. And it also must accompany with it an instructional guide that outlines the steps for how to conduct a roadside inspection using an ELD. So these are just the minimal steps that an ELD provider must undertake. So what are some other ways a provider can give assurance to a carrier that it meets the requirements? Well, for example, with EROAD, EROAD's elected to take an extra step of third-party unbiased verification with an agency called PIT Group. This involved bench testing and live operational testing with a motor carrier to generate all the likely scenarios and go through the FMCSA's test procedures and the mandate requirements to make sure that all the criteria have been passed. So for a carrier, make sure that it's important to ask those ELD providers questions about what did they do for registration and what else can they provide to be able to make sure that they have done everything to meet the mandate. So go and ask those providers the right questions to make sure that you are fully aware of what you are getting when you select that particular device.
Yes, and it's also important. So Soona has this link to the website that has the ELD providers. There's approximately 60 Soona on there right now.
That's correct.
Yep. The manuals are on there. They have to be on there with this list. Please look over and review the manuals. Just because they are on this list does not mean they meet all of those requirements to be an ELD. And you can look through their manuals and with the information just in this PowerPoint right here that Soona's going through and we're going through, and you can see that some of them do not actually meet the specifications to be an ELD. So please review that, look at this, go to this link, look what's on there. You have plenty of folks to choose from. Inform yourself and make sure that you're making a good decision.
Great. Okay, so we've had this question come up so many times, so let's drill it right down. What does an AOBRD grandfathering really mean for you? Okay, so the grandfathered in means if you have installed an AOBRD in your vehicle before December 18th of 2017, you will get an extra 2 years to transition to an ELD. So this means you have until December 16th of 2019 to change over from your AOBRD to an ELD. So really, the FMCSA meant for this provision to be a way to give extra time for carriers to carefully plan and transition to an ELD. They really did appreciate that it takes a lot of effort and time for a carrier to go through the full transition with their fleets. You know, especially for those ones that have a lot of vehicles there, to understand what's involved, they gave this provision to be that leeway. So think carefully and understand what having an AOBRD, so let's think carefully about what it means to have an AOBRD past December 18, 2017. What does it really mean for your operations? So specifically, what if you're intending on growing your operations past that date? FMCSA actually provided a clarification in February that if you're using an AOBRD and you replace a vehicle with another one, you can actually install that existing AOBRD in your new vehicle. So let's say you have 50 vehicles, you sell one of those vehicles and get it replaced by another one. That AOBRD that you had installed in your old vehicle can be placed into your new vehicle even after December 18, 2017. However, if you end up increasing your fleet size, let's say you add new vehicles after December 18, 2017, it actually means that you will require an ELD on those new vehicles. So what it really means is that the so-called grandfathering applies on a per vehicle basis rather than on a fleet or a carrier basis. So just because you have an AOBRD in your vehicle does not mean that you can continue with AOBRDs until December 2019. You may be impacted by having to manage multiple back-end support systems. You may have one for your AOBRDs and then one for your ELDs. And this may also mean additional administration and compliance processes and costs. And also it may affect you by delaying this implementation of ELDs as we discussed earlier. So Susan, can you see other operational challenges that carriers can face if they are going through this growth spurt after December 17, 2017?
Yes, and always going back to the training. So say that you have AOBRs and you have ELDs. So you have back-end systems that are different, and there could be multiple reasons for that. Maybe your AOBRD provider isn't capable of providing a fully compliant ELD yet, or so on and so forth. If you have drivers that are going between vehicles, so they might be using a vehicle with an AOBRD one day, and then the next day they might be jumping into a vehicle that has an ELD. Look at the different requirements. There's 3 paragraphs of regulations, and the miles per hour that we talked about. So they'll be operating under one set of rules for the AOBRD, and then the days that they're in the ELD, they have a whole other different set of requirements. So you're doing 2 different types of training. You're training on the functionality and the operational specifications for an AOBRD, plus then you're going to be training and expecting the driver to, understand the ELD and what it can and can't do. And so it's depending on the driver, you could be setting them up, for a compliance nightmare and to where they're not going to be successful. They might be, having issues with their logbooks, and it's very confusing. So just make sure that you're aware of that. They could be switching back and forth. They could be going back between multiple systems, and then you might need, especially the personal conveyance and things like that, 2 different sets of policies. Yeah. For that.
Well, those are some great points there, Susan. So it's clear from the differences that we've discussed earlier that the AOBRD may need to be upgraded. So it's important to understand how an AOBRD will actually transition to an ELD. So a software upgrade means it's a new version of software that offers a significant change or improvement on the current version. This can mean a driver sees a new interface and navigational steps can be different, and so there may need to be new training around this new software. A hardware upgrade may need to be had as well, where a physical change to the device may occur, whether it may mean new cabling connections, new attachments, or even a replacement. So you will need to ask those questions of an AOBRD provider. Is it going to require a software upgrade, or is it actually a hardware upgrade, or is it both? And when will they occur? Because you will need to make sure that it's giving you enough time before that December date in 2019 to make sure that you can work through those with your drivers and your support staff.
And if there's a cost associated with that.
That is true too.
So ask if you're using an AOBRD and it's going to need some hardware upgrade and there are those physical components, how much is that going to cost you? Is there a cost? So talk to your AOBRD provider and say, what is this going to cost me, so that you can plan for that. That's part of that 2 years as well.
That's right. Okay. So in any case, so Susan, based on all the engagements with our customers to date and working with them on their transition, what will be some of your tips to prepare for this compliance with the ELD mandate?
Okay. Well, one more thing I want to mention about the grandfathering clause is the reason. So, we talked to FMCSA. Soona attends a lot of the meetings that they have with the ELD vendors, and we've talked about them. What the purpose of the grandfathering clause was. Going back to that. There's a lot of legacy systems out there that have larger carriers, fleets in the thousands, and so they wanted to afford them the opportunity, for to be able to update their system. And then, it takes a lot longer for a fleet of 8,000 to implement a change than a fleet of 50 or 40 or something like that. So the extra 2 years is for, was built in for them. So it wasn't really meant as, hey, you have until December of 2017. If you haven't done anything, you can go get an AOBRD. So AOBRD, the rules and requirements for that, they have an expiration date.
That's right.
And the technology has an expiration date. Everything has to be an ELD. So, if you're part of that 50-something% you haven't decided yet, what you're doing, at this point in time, with 6 months left, to be looking at an AOBRD. That's why we're having this webinar right here. Is please, understand the point and the purpose for that extra 2 years was for already existing systems and for carriers that are already using the system. It's not really meant and designed to be like, hey, get this right away so you have an extra 2 years. There's not really an extra 2 years for you. it's for those folks that already have something, and for, you know, those legacy systems that, you know, have some challenges and need to meet the new requirement. So, you know, that's just another tip. Make sure you're aware of that, and make sure you're aware there's a reason for the grandfathering clause, and be fully aware of where you're going.
That's true.
Okay, so tips to prepare for the compliance with the ELD mandate. So, number one, make sure you strategize your transition. You know, understand the device that you're choosing, and to make sure you're understanding the device, make sure you're understanding your operations. What Soona and I are finding is, you know, we're assisting carriers in, you know, onboarding, you know, a technology solution, and a lot of problems the carriers are facing is you know, paper-based systems are great, but, you know, when you start really taking a deep dive into your operations, you might not fully understand them as well as you think you do.
That's right.
Your company policies might not, you know, match. So, you know, make sure that the device that you're choosing, you know, matches your operations, and you're weighing the impacts on your operations that this device is going to do for you. So consider and clearly outline the following. Make sure that you have your timing planned out. These things take time. So it takes time to install. It takes time to train. It takes time to, you know, and training involves multiple different points. Drivers, mechanics, shop folks, you know, your dispatchers, your safety folks. So, you know, make sure, maybe it might be a good idea to do phases of implementation rather than, hey, we're gonna, you know, we're gonna install and train everybody and do everything all in one weekend. That might not be the best strategy. Decide who needs to be involved during the process, who's doing what pre-process, during, and post, because, you know, afterwards you're going to have someone that's going to need to be the point of contact for the drivers if there's an issue. It is technology, there will be issues. So kind of plan this out, write it down, have a plan. That is a good way to make sure you're going to be successful. Soona, do you have anything to add that would be helpful for the strategizing part?
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think one of the things that we've considered is, you know, with working with our customers was make sure that you have all of the right people involved early on in the process. You know, going through the transitions, there's about 6 months remaining before the first compliance date at the end of this year, where, you know, for those of you that are using paper, we'll need to transition to an ELD. So think ahead, think early. You know, some of the most successful transitions that I've witnessed involved having a group of drivers that are driver champions across your business that are really involved in that transition period. So think ahead, get everybody involved in your organizations that need to be there, and like Susan said, you know, go through it, you know, early and during, and do a retrospective after that too.
Great for that. Number 2, take it for a test drive. Try before you buy. So an interesting thing. So if you're looking at an AOBR, you're actually going to be trialing an AOBR. So it might not have all the functionality or the test specs built into it. So you might not be fully able to test all of the things that an ELD will be required to show. So just know that if you're going to test out and you're going to pilot, make sure, you know, the AOBR can meet or will meet the ELD requirements that Soona went through. So it's good to, you know, do a week trial, do a 2-week trial. You know, it's getting down to it. So, you know, unfortunately, you're not going to have the 90-day periods where you were afforded earlier in the year. But it's a good idea to check to see what it's going to look like, because not all ELDs are the same. There's over 60 out there. You know, some of them are BYODs, kind of bring your own device, that require a tablet or a phone, and that you know, requires data plans and things like that. Most of the units that are on the registry right now are a BYOD type of system. There's, I think, 3 or 4 that are in-cab total all-in-one solution device like EROAD that are on the mandate, that they're on the registry. But there's different systems. So make sure that you are looking into that, and going back to the slide or the operations 1 here, make sure it's going to fit your operations and that you're looking at the cost for that. Check for these following things: how easy it is to use. If the drivers can't figure it out, it has lots of bells and whistles, and they don't know how to do it, you know, that's where you're going to understand what your training requirements are going to be. How easy is it for the back office staff to use? How easy is it for the dispatchers? There's lots of people here that are going to be using the system. So multiple different levels of understanding technology. look at your drivers, look at the systems, have a good match on where you're going to be most successful. How accurate the system is, it's good when you're testing to look at, match it up with paper logs. Please do paper logs while you're testing out at the same time. And make sure you're reviewing and you're auditing the paper versus the system to make sure that accuracy is there. Going through an audit and having an auditor tell you it's not accurate is the wrong time to find out that the system you've chosen doesn't have that. Make sure it's reliable. What's the uptime? You don't want to be dealing with these devices, it's supposed to make things easier, not harder. So if you've got someone that's spending 40% of their day running around chasing, these units down that aren't working, or, trying to call support and trying to fix them, that just kind of goes in the backwards direction of where you want to be. And that it's supporting operational requirements for your business. Number 3. Time to update those company policies and practices, our favorite thing to do. One thing at OTA I did was to help folks do this, and it was usually on the back shelf in the back burner because it's painful to do. But now that you're going into the ELD and it's a whole new world, we're getting rid of paper, it's a great time to just kind of do it all at once. Make sure that you're jotting down what the requirements are for training, define and outline criteria and restrictions for the use of those 2 special driving categories Soona went over. So yard moves, what do you consider a yard? Federal Motor Carrier does not actually have a definition for what a yard is. All they've said is it's not something like your pilot flying J or something like that, but define what a yard is, when the drivers can use it, when they can't use it. You might, if you're not running up against the 11-hour or the 14-hour very often, you might want to just take it out and not even have it be available for the drivers. That might, just be less confusing for them. And we've heard that you got plenty of time for your 11-hour and your 14, that they just don't even have it put on there for the drivers so that it's not going to trip them up. So make sure you have that. Personal conveyance policies, the personal conveyance rules haven't changed, but you might want to define when and who can use that and why. So setting out the expectations for the drivers, ELDs do put the power back into the driver's hands, because they have to, in order for a carrier to suggest an edit, the driver has to have certified it first. So they want the driver to, have the power to review his logs, look at his logs. You can help him by suggesting edits, and then, he can accept it or reject it. But, make sure that those expectations are outlined for the driver, that he's supposed to do that, and make it a positive thing. It is a positive thing. They're his logs or her logs, They should have the right to say, if that log is correct or not, and what can be edited and what can't be. Develop and define for policies for logging in and logging out for all staff. Federal Motor Carrier clearly defines that only authorized personnel should have access to those driver logs to be able to edit them. So make sure you have a policy on that. So who is able in your organization to suggest edits to those logs, to see those logs, to view those logs, to help the driver with those logs. And for the drivers logging in and logging out, make sure you write down, have a policy that the drivers are not to share their PIN numbers with anybody. Just keep it to themselves. That's theirs. If anybody else can access their logs, that would be a good excuse for them to say that wasn't my time, somebody else used my login. So to continue to review and update, policies and procedures as time goes on, we all know that that's kind of a given in this industry. And number 4, training. Train, 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 train. You will be as successful as the amount of time that you take to train your drivers. Set your team up for success, and this is going to correlate to how well you're going to train. So drivers need to be trained. Mechanics need to be trained. Dispatchers, fleet managers, safety managers, human resources, anybody that's going to be in the system, the longer you take, and always look at your ELD or your AOBRD provider, look at their website, see what types of materials that they have available for you. EROAD has a help site that we have train the trainer decks for our ELD for the drivers that explains how to use the system. Some other systems might have webinars that they'll walk you through. So just look at that, see what see what training systems are available that they provide, and then what you're going to do. Work with your ELD provider. This is a relationship that you guys are going to have. You're going to be in a contract, with your ELD provider. So, it's communication is key. Working with them on, their user manuals, if they're friendly or not, if they need to be updated. What is it? written in text speak, or is it written in driver speak? You know, are they easily understandable? What type of training materials, like we went over? Instruction and guidance materials, you know, there needs to be a component required per the mandate for roadside inspections, how that transfer process happens, the malfunctions and data diagnostics. So you might need to order more to get in there. And make sure you have them in the trucks that's required, and what type of customer and technical support, you know, how many days they're available, what hours they're open. Make sure you have all of that down ahead of time. So know ahead of time where to go, how to get help on technical issues or compliance questions. Just set that you will have questions and you will have issues, because you will. But make sure you know where to go. Everything's written down, who your person is, you know, that you go for, and make sure the drivers know as well.
Those are some really helpful tips there, Susan. Okay, so going forward,
is that all the tips we have? We have 5. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, so it's time for some question and answers. So Brittany, have we been receiving a lot of questions?
Yes, we have been receiving a ton of questions, so thank you, everyone. The first one is, if the ELD goes down, what is your recording requirement in the meantime?
That's a great question. So under the 395.34, you have 8 days to be able to fix and resolve any malfunctions. And during the malfunctions, a driver is required to start keeping paper logs. So actually within, there's a requirement that you provide your drivers with at least 8 days of blank paper logs, so that they can start to create their logs in case during those 8 days that you are trying to fix a malfunction, they may need to still be running. So they need to be able to capture their hours of service information, and they need to be writing that down on paper. So.
And they're also, so driver's not going to be left high and dry. That's why the user manual has to be in the cab, and there's also the data diagnostic malfunction card that needs to be in the cab. So when there is an issue with the ELD, the driver knows what to do. So they can look at the visor card, and it'll show them what type of data diagnostic or malfunction code is thrown. They go to the visor card, they see what they're supposed to do. They can go to the manual as well. They also can call the carrier, and the carrier can help them what to do, but paper's always the backup.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, guys. And with EROAD, we had a question: when you geofence your yard, is it capable of automatically switching to yard mode?
That's actually a question that came up. So I attended a public meeting at the FMCSA on May 9th, where they were explaining and clarifying a lot of these technical questions that have been coming up. And one of the things they clarified was that with respect to the yard move and how it needs to be selected, it cannot be selected automatically by a system by entering into a geofence. So it must be selected by the driver manually when they are going to drive in a yard, and that yard must be defined by the carrier in their company policies. However, you know, in terms of the geofencing, it can, you know, there are providers that will provide, you know, information around when the driver has entered into that particular geofence and how long they stayed for. But those are kind of the supporting documentation ex post. You cannot do that automatically.
And that was a great question, because, you know, that's the point of this webinar, the difference between AOBR's legacy systems out there and ELDs. There are some AOBRs that do that right now. So as an AOBRD, you might be able to do that now, but with an ELD, you can't. So it's very specific, FMCSA, manual entry by the driver only. It can't be autos. Okay, so great question.
Yeah.
All right, and our next question, we had a few around this. Is the ELD mandate going to be mandatory for all states?
That is actually a really good question. So we are aware that with the federal requirement, which is the mandate for ELDs, the states actually have, I think, 3 years in order for them to determine whether they want to adopt ELDs as a mandated requirement or not. Now, for the intrastate drivers. Now, you know, each of the states will make the decision individually. And as far as we're aware, you know, Florida, Texas have made a decision to adopt, but at a later date. So I think I think it was Florida who are going to adopt it in 2019 for the intrastate drivers, and Texas is also at a later date as well. So what I would encourage is to, understand that, each of those states will make their own decisions in adoption of the ELDs for intrastate drivers, and when that will apply. As far as I'm aware, Oregon, for example, has adopted it as it is. So the compliant states will also be the same for the intrastate drivers. So it will be 2017 for the adoption if you are using paper, and then it will be 2019 if you are not if you're using an AOBRD. So the grandfathering exists.
Yeah.
So.
And a good question, you can call your state DOT official and ask them. I think there's 20, 24, 20, I don't know the exact number, but 20-something states that automatically auto-adopt any federal regulations. So you can ask them, say, do you auto-adopt? And if they auto-adopt, that means you're going to be either by December of this year or early, like Oregon's an auto-adopt state, but they have to write in the code for the OER. They have to, so it takes time to write in, so I think April is about the time. But Washington is gonna, so Washington State is adopting right away. Mm-hmm. So just call and ask your DOT official if your state is an auto-adopt state or not. I know California is not an auto-adopt state, mm-hmm. so they're looking at a later time frame. So you have some time to think about it. Yeah, ask if they're auto-adopt state, and if they're not, when they're actually looking at adopting. They have 3 years.
And one final comment that I'll make to this question is that, it doesn't change the intrastate hours of service rule sets.
That's great.
What it does change is the way in which you record your hours of service information, that it needs to be using an ELD. However, like I was mentioning, the intrastate rule set, if you are operating under those, it may not be changing those. Okay.
It won't. Yes, correct. That's awesome.
And we did have a specific question about California hours of service versus the FMCSA hours of service, mm-hmm. and if they need to adopt ELDs or not. Do you recommend that they just call their Department of Transportation?
Yes. So yes, California. Yeah, California is not an auto adopt, so you do have some time. So it will be coming. They will have to within a certain period of time, and so the 3 years is from February, so it'll be by February of 2019. Is that right? I can't count. So 2019,
2018.
2018. There you go. So, but just what Soona said. So intrastate hours of service
does not change.
That stays the same, but you will need to have an ELD when California does adopt it, which is not going to be in the near future. So not next. It won't be. It's 2017. It won't be probably early 2019.
Right.
But call. Yeah, I would suggest what Brittany said. Please call your California DOT guys and say, hey, when can we expect that we need to make this change in our operations and get this thing?
Yeah. Thank you. And we have another question. How can I tell if what I am currently using is an AOBRD or an ELD?
That's a good question. The first thing you would need to do is to actually call the provider of that solution to ask what they are designed to meet. So if they are an AOBRD solution, they will need to present you with a certificate to say that it is compliant to the AOBRD specifications. Now with an ELD, you can quickly check yourself by going to that FMCSA registry and seeing if that solution is appearing on that registry. So again, AOBRDs, you won't be able to see those on the registry, so you have to ask the provider, hey, can you present me with the certificate that says that it is AOBRD compliant? And then the next follow-up question that I would think is for you to ask, when will you make it an ELD for me to transition to?
And so buyer beware. So we've had a lot of, the reason why we did this webinar, a lot of confusion out there with ELD, AOBR terminology being interchangeable and thrown around out there. So you may see, it's a marketing strategy. You may see, a lot, I'm sure you guys are getting inundated with calls and, all this different type of stuff, buy our ELD, ELD. So you might have folks that say they're an ELD. If they are not on that registry, if they're not self-certified, if you follow that link Soona put on there, and if they are not on that registry, they are not an ELD. They are not an ELD until they are on that list. So if you say, someone says, hey, we have an ELD, you get pulled over after December deadline 2019, you either don't have the certificate saying you're an AOBR and you're not on the registry, you'll get put out of service for 10 hours. So make sure, check on the list. Well, you said you're an ELD, but you're not on the list. And if they can, they might give you the runaround, but they have to be on that list to be considered an ELD. And if they don't, they need that certificate saying they're an AOBR. Great.
Perfect. And we have another question. If I have an AOBRD and I'm unable to remove it from the truck during an inspection, will I get put out of service?
And that's a good question. If you are between the time period of December 2017 and December 2019, and you are using that system, then you can comply with the AOBRD requirements, which means you don't necessarily need to take it out of the cab to show it. However, after 2019, you will need that device to comply with one of the backup options that we talked about earlier. So it needs to either be able to be untethered and be taken out of the vehicle to be handed to the enforcement official outside of the vehicle, or the AOBRD provider may need to provide an integration with a printer to be able to print the ELD output. So either way, ask that AOBRD provider how they will need to transition you, what kind of upgrade will you need to go through in order for it to become a compliant ELD. Is it going to just be a software upgrade, or is it going to require a hardware upgrade? If so, what will it involve, and what will it mean for you? Does it cost you anything? So just ask those questions and make sure you're equipped to be able to make the right decision for your operation.
Yes, but so you can use an AOBRD the next 2 years and you will not get put out of service if it can't get handed out the window. But you need to plan for that transition when you need that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then we did have one last question. What types of training does EROAD provide, and do you charge extra for these services?
So training, God, somebody's listening to my training pounding down here. So EROAD has, like we were talking about, we have a help site for ELDs. We have lots of training videos that we did with the driver in mind. They're about 2 to 6 minutes each that go through the device itself. We have we provide onboarding training and support with customer service when you get on, and we do not charge for any of these services. So any training, you'll be assigned an onboarding specialist. All of those just come with the package. There's no extra cost for that. And so website, train the trainer decks, videos, and throughout all of our back office depot system, there's little question marks that you can click on that actually will walk you through whatever that system is. So no charge for that, and all included.
Thank you so much, Susan. So it's about time to wrap up. Thank you all again for your questions. If we didn't get to yours during this session, then we will follow up with you personally. Again, as a reminder, we will send an email with the slides and recording. We will also be including an EROAD red paper that covers this topic, so you can share it with your colleagues who also may want the additional information. We're going to go back to Vilya for our closing comments.
Thank you, Brittany, Soona, and Susan with EROAD for taking time today to educate all of us about the differences between ELDs and AOBRDs. EROAD has been an OTA member since 2012. For those of you that are not yet familiar with the Oregon Trucking Associations, we are the official trade organization for the trucking industry in the state of Oregon. We work with carriers and pretty much anyone that operates a truck or provides products and services to the trucking industry. Our members have full access to resources related to safety and compliance, regulation, technology and maintenance, government affairs, annual permits, and more, such as webinars like this. We host over 100 educational opportunities around the state annually, including training classes. Our next big event is actually taking place on September 13th to 15th. It's going to be the Leadership Convention at Salishan, and EROAD will be there. So if you are interested, you can find more information on our website. As we mentioned earlier, slides from today's presentation will be available to members via the member login on our website, or feel free to email us at info@ortrucking.org. Again, that's info@ortrucking.org. And our website is listed on there as well. It's ortrucking.org. So thank you, everyone, on the webinar, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.